It's an important question. It's not one that diplomats talk about very much.
Do you think that that creates any risk of sanctions being lifted?
It just says you can volunteer to liberate some of that money and put it towards the Ukraine cause. It doesn't actually give them any impunity.
But why would they then?
Some oligarchs may feel that that's a business transaction worth making.
And what Ukraine has to do in order to show this willingness to fight?
There's no war fatigue.
How will the future of Russia look like after Ukraine's victory, in your opinion?
Honestly, I don't care.
Thank you very much for having this interview with us. Before we started recording, we were discussing how the experiences that many Ukrainians had of separation with their loved ones when wives would take the kids outside the country to safety and their husbands would stay in Ukraine. How much do you feel, do you share this feeling of separation working as an ambassador in Ukraine during the full scale invasion?
Well, thank you, because I think it's an important question. It's not one that diplomats talk about very much for obvious reasons. I was in Odessa some months ago with the president for the grain deal when it was first set up, and we were doing interviews back then, and a soldier came over to me, and he took his chevron off his shoulder. He said he wanted to give it to me because his wife had gone to the UK at the beginning of last year. She had not wanted to go, but he had told her she needed to go. So she had gone to the UK and had found a family who had taken her in, and she got her visa, and she had written to him to say that she missed Ukraine very much and she missed him very much, but the family was lovely and they were being kind and she felt safe. And he said knowing that she felt safe made it easier for him to fight, and he wanted to give me this chevron to say thank you. And I was very moved by that, but it also oddly reminded me a little, as weird as this sounds, of my own situation, because I and many other colleagues were likewise separated from our families. Our families had to leave before this invasion. My family actually left a couple of years before then, when the pandemic first began, and they were never able to come back because, of course, it was followed by the invasion. And that has made this a much harder experience because, of course, it's naturally more lonely. I think this is what all Ukrainians are feeling, that sense of separation can really hurt. And so I think there is a common sense of that the international community actually shares with Ukrainians' sense of that separation. And it's also something that's kept me at the work, because I understand when that soldier tells me that, I have a little bit of a sense of it myself.
When was the last time that you saw your husband?
So I've probably only seen him 2 or 3 times at all in the last year, and actually only 2 or 3 times every year whenever I've been able to go back to the UK. He was supposed to move out here, and he was about to when flights stopped because of the pandemic. And so we had to see through the pandemic, and then after that we said, right, move out, and then he couldn't. So this has been a real story of separation for us, and actually of fortitude for the two of us. This isn't just a challenge for me as an ambassador, it's also been a challenge for me as a person in a long-term marriage, trying to make sure that this separation isn't too hard for both of us.
The United Kingdom undoubtedly helped a lot to many Ukrainians, both hosting them, but also on the governmental level, providing Ukraine with outstanding support in many regards. But if we are talking about military support specifically, is there any sense of understanding that the West's expectations over Ukraine's counteroffensive, they very much rely on how many weapons Ukraine has? And do you believe that maybe the expectations of the West of Ukraine's performance on the battlefield are a little bit at times more optimistic than they should be, having the weapons that are available to Ukrainians?
So I think it's a bit general to talk about the West like it's one thing. I personally am a little critical of media coverage in general about Ukraine's counteroffensive, because media coverage in general has been quite binary. and has suggested that, you know, you just need to line up your soldiers in the right place and you can take it back. I think that the defence minister and actually the president have been really clear that this was never a sprint, it's a marathon. And I'm always struck when I talk with colleagues in the UK how difficult it is for them to remember how long that contact line is, how diverse Ukraine is. Kyiv was liberated in a very different way from Kherson, and they have a multitude of challenges. So I don't think it's as binary as they need more equipment, although for sure I agree with the fact that they need more equipment. But if you gave Ukraine more equipment, I'm not sure how much it would speed it up, because you are still talking about the size of the territory, the diverse nature of the territory, the fact that the Russians are dug in very well, and that this was always going to take time. I mean, Ukraine is one of the most mined countries in the world now. Ukrainian soldiers are having to deal with that. It's an unbelievably difficult task, and it requires patience from them, but also from all of us. That's a very difficult message for any country that is providing weaponry and wants to see, you know, clearly measurable results to take. But I nonetheless believe that to be the case. I think it's going to be some time yet. I think we have to be talking about the strategic approach that Ukrainians are taking. There's plenty of debate about that. But I don't think we can assume that if you just put the right stuff in their hands, it's all going to change tomorrow.
But if we're talking about some planes like F-16, will that change the situation dramatically in your view?
Well, it's perfectly clear that if you want to talk about air supremacy, if Ukraine doesn't have air supremacy, there's no point in having that debate. So, you know, yes, obviously they need air capability. But F-16s aren't things you put in someone's hand and say, go tomorrow either. This is a capability Ukraine has not had. It's not usual capability historically here. That means that people need to be trained. They also need to be serviced in a different way. You need engineers who know what they're doing. These are not excuses for F-16s not coming as fast as I know Ukrainians want them. But we all make a mistake if we think it's just about shipping a few airplanes over and then, you know, you get in them, you fly off, and that's the end of the war. It really is more complex than that. That is why the UK offered training before F-16s became available, because at the point where they are available, at least, you know, you begin to have a cohort of pilots who do actually know how to use them.
And the training is ongoing, right?
That's right. Summer. And a coalition for training is building, which is great, because you need more people, obviously. You need at scale people to be able to go through that training.
Also wanted to talk a little bit about Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and his statements at NATO summit in Vilnius, which evoked some criticism, so to say. He talked about Ukraine's lack of gratitude to the allies for weapons, namely the phrase, whether we like it or not, people want to see a bit of gratitude. Do you agree that Ukraine is asking for too much from its Western allies?
Well, I think it's quite important the whole of Ben Wallace's interview is read. Because when you read the whole of it, it's pretty clear that he is not making that pointed a point. And in any case, if you look back at Ben Wallace's track record, Ben Wallace has been one of Ukraine's closest friends. People talk about Boris Johnson, and indeed Boris Johnson did show the right leadership at the right time, historic leadership at the right time. But Ben Wallace was in his cabinet, and Ben Wallace was sorting out those end laws and making sure that they arrived. And he has been consistent, not just during the war, but all through before the war. He had visited here maybe 5 or 6 times in my first 2 years here. You could not ask for a more supportive, but also a defence secretary with a better understanding of what Ukraine was facing. So when you put all that together and you look at the interview, what he was trying to express was a general concern, if you like, that the more Ukraine asks, the more pressure, of course, that puts on some countries, the more they want a conversation, both about how that weaponry is being used in their military strategy, but also this issue about gratitude. I personally haven't seen this lack of gratitude. On the contrary, I follow social media closely. I see that the president, the defence minister, etc., are very clear every time there is an announcement from an ally. They acknowledge, and we know because there are visits here, that they have very good conversations. But I think what our defence secretary was trying to do was to just convey a sense that inevitably that pressure from these requests will grow as countries look back to their stores and ask Ukraine to be alive to that pressure when they have those conversations. I genuinely do not believe that Ben Wallace was making a binary criticism of Ukraine, even if it came across that way.
Still, do you think that Ukraine is asking for too much, making these requests, and these requests are excessive, and Ukraine is asking for something that the West, collective West, so to say, could not really provide Ukraine with?
See, the difficulty, I think, is that I'm not a military expert, so it's only too much if you understand how those capabilities are being put to use. I come back to what I was saying before. This is a diverse invasion of a massive range of territory in which you will be engaging in different ways, and I leave it to military experts to work out whether Ukraine is asking for too much or asking for the right thing. But, you know, that's what Ramstein is for, and we know that Ukraine participates actively in Ramstein.
Ukraine and Britain have just begun their talks on security guarantees for Ukraine. Could you please share with us any insights, if there are any, on what Britain has to offer to Ukraine regarding security, apart from what was publicly aired following the G7 security commitments?
Well, I can't, unfortunately, because our first conversations were informal. They only happened last week. They'll be crystallising as we go through the months. So at the moment, I can't go beyond the commitments that, as you say, are public and that we made as part of the G7.
Lately, top-level Western officials have made many controversial statements regarding the possible peace between Ukraine and Russia and the bargaining of territories, so to say. I wanted to ask you whether you believe that any peace with Russia is possible by just giving away some of Ukraine's land.
Emphatically, no. I'm astonished that people even think there can be a debate about it, not because of what's happening now, but because of what you can see in history. You really don't need anything other than to look back to 2014, and you really don't need anything other than to look not just at Ukraine, but at Moldova and Georgia, etc. There is no question that if Ukraine settled in any way by agreeing that Russia could hold on to any part of this occupied territory, Russia would use it to remilitarize and launch again. It's absolutely clear, because they've done it before. So I do not see a way forward whereby Ukraine cedes territory that is sustainable.
But do you think that the pressure over Ukraine can grow with time, as you've just mentioned about the provision of weaponry for Ukraine, or with the countries looking back at their stocks? If the pressure to grow within time, do you think that Ukraine could be cornered to actually sign these peace agreements with Russia and give away some territories in order to, keep receiving financial aid from Western allies?
At this time, I don't see any sense of that conditionality. There are elections in some countries, and one would have to look again, right, depending on the outcomes of those elections. At this time, I don't see anything other than the consistency of message that these countries stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Let's return back to Britain as well, and just talk about the bilateral relationship in the regard of sanctions and how the UK is tackling its own security issues involving Russia. So I wanted to ask you whether you believe that the West, and including the UK, which has indeed in the past welcomed Russian proceeds of corruption money for years, bears any responsibility for Russia's feeling of permissiveness that triggered consequently its invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think you can point to several things that triggered Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't actually think that their access to, bank accounts or schools or nice trips or yachts were a reason for them to invade Ukraine. I think that came from elsewhere. But what I do think has happened, so many transformational things have happened as a result of this. But one is that not just sanctions, but the UK has looked much more closely at the tools that they did put in place to tackle corrupt sources of finance in the UK. So unexplained wealth orders is a very good example of an initiative that was put through Parliament and was implemented, but was really quite slow in its first couple of years, and now further legislation has been passed to give that mechanism more teeth, and also to make sure that sanctions stand for longer. So I think we are learning the lessons of how you make sure that these mechanisms are safeguarded so they can actually do their job.
But if we're talking about this feeling of not being punished, as in, Germany really continued some business as usual with the Nord Stream 2. The UK hosted some Russia's money that were injected there for years and years. And there was this feeling that whatever Russia does with illegal annexation of Crimea, occupation of part of the Donbass in 2014, really doesn't evoke any severe consequences. The sanctions, as you said, didn't have that many teeth as they do today. So do you think that somehow maybe impacted Russia's feeling, well, if we're not punished, we can just proceed with whatever we want to achieve in Ukraine?
Well, I think that Russia responds to strength. Ukrainians have always said this, but not just military strength. So if you put tools in place and they aren't proven to exert that same strength, then yeah, that will be taken as a message that they can proceed. The same happens in the international community. You know, every time you put through a Security Council resolution about Ukraine, you must make sure, and we do make sure, that there is a very strong support behind it, and Russia takes note of that message. If there isn't, if it's fudged, if something happens, that sends the same message that yes, it's a tacit message that Russia can do what they want. But if I'm honest with you, we have enough on our plates to think about how we can keep this level of strength consistent across all elements of what we do, because this is a hybrid invasion, and I would rather, and have frankly, put more energy that way than worrying about the past.
Talking about the current affairs, there are still oligarchs in Russian oligarchs in Britain that are under sanctions, who enjoy monthly allowances, consequently letting them carry on with their luxurious lifestyles, namely Friedman and others. Do you believe that the sanctions that are in place against Russian oligarchs in the UK are hurting them enough, or there is room for improvement?
But I think, I mean, sanctions are reviewed regularly by our team and by our government and our minister, which is why you keep seeing new waves of sanctions, but also sometimes you see additional sanction legislation. It's a direct result of those reviews. So you apply the sanctions, you sit back, you look at the effect, and then you come back at it and look at it again, not just for the numbers of people, but also why you're imposing sanctions. So we've imposed sanctions on people who have promoted disinformation, for example. That's new, we didn't do that before, but we're doing that now. And then you also look back at the extent to which it has impact. Look, sanctions they're a blunt tool, they take time to bite. If you go after someone's personal finances, then that has the most immediate effect. But of course, if you're an oligarch and you're working with, several billions, you kind of also know how to conserve your billions. I mean, if you've got to that level of wealth, you kind of sort of know how to protect your assets. And so it requires that kind of layered effect to keep looking back at where these other sources may be, and if they are about sources inside the UK, then yes, you've got to go after that. It's a bit like looking at, weaponry being provided to Russia, and you tell yourself, we are not providing weaponry to Russia, we can feel good about that. Then the Ukrainians pick up a missile, take it apart, and they find 32 bits that come from different European countries. It's a constant conversation to work out how Russia is exploiting loopholes or using pieces of the system that we haven't yet explored ourselves to try to get around these sanctions. So it's an ongoing piece of work.
Indeed, and also, to make the sanctions go in line with one another, right?
Yeah.
If we're talking about different countries involved and
Yes.
different legislations.
Yes, although I actually think that's had a benign effect, a good effect. We may not all at the same time sanction the same individual or the same entity, but we are talking with each other regularly. So I have seen that, for example, where one country, say the US, has someone on the sanctions list, maybe we don't, that follows quite soon afterwards, and there is quite strong parity between the EU list and UK and US, for example. So I see that actually as quite a good sort of cycle.
Returning back to the oligarchs' allowance, do you think if the UK is to cut the monthly allowance, that would inevitably lead these oligarchs to, living more reserved kind of life, and then consequently maybe that would impact on their decision to cut their ties with Putin, or try to convey a message that it's enough is enough, or
so I don't think it's helpful to talk personally about oligarchs, nor actually do I think it's helpful to collectivise them. They have different incentives. Many of them have got their money in different ways, and there are differentiated conversations to be had with them. But I actually also think this is a conversation that needs to be led by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians tell us, our sanctions are led by a conversation with Ukraine, who tells us things like, for example, weapons parts are being made in these countries. We have the same conversations at a strategic level about sanctions. And, you know, when it comes to the question of reparations, that too will need to be set by Ukraine in terms of sanctions on oligarchs. So I'm not sure it helps to go down to that level of detail like the international community is imposing it. I think that is something that needs to come to us from Ukraine. And I think any oligarch who wants sanctions lifted, that too is a conversation with Ukraine.
A question about sanctions being lifted. So the UK recently passed in new legislation which allows oligarchs to voluntarily give away the assets that had been seized previously. Do you think that that creates any risk of sanctions being lifted? Because many oligarchs are fighting it in courts for the sanctions to be released from them.
They are, but the issue of sanctions being able to be voluntarily lifted against if you like, a reparation, the nature of that is a three-way conversation with Ukraine. So this isn't about us unilaterally saying this is fine. And also that legislation doesn't say, and therefore there'll be no sanctions, or therefore you won't find yourself in the International Criminal Court, or any of that. It just says you can volunteer to liberate some of that money and put it towards the Ukraine cause. It doesn't actually give them any impunity.
But why would they then?
Because I think they would probably, look, I'm not an oligarch, not a person who's got so many billions as to be thinking in that mindset, but I'm sure that those who can see the proportionate loss of their income, even if maybe they do still have teams of advisors, might think that by paying it forward, so doing something now, it may lessen any further penalty that comes in the future. So, you know, if you really think you're someone who hasn't done malign business with Putin, you've just got lots of money because you profited from the Russian regime directly or indirectly, if you put a piece of that money towards the very cause that we're all trying to help, well, then that indicates that your future intentions will align. And so, you know, some oligarchs may feel that that's a business transaction worth making, but let's see.
Yeah, well, that could really look like a business transaction because some of these oligarchs might not be genuine about their help.
No, they might not be. But I mean, no one said that sanctions were going to result in people undergoing a change of heart. I mean, sanctions against the Russian state aren't going to make Russia think that they've done the wrong thing. What sanctions do is make it more difficult for them to do the wrong thing. So I'm sorry, but these aren't ideological tools. They are practical, punitive tools. The question of how you get round to a different mindset whereby Russians decide they're not going to invade Ukraine anymore, that is a completely different subject.
Okay, so how far is the UK from moving from freezing assets of the Russians to actually seizing and confiscating and then transferring these assets to Ukraine for reconstruction?
I would say we're in about the same place as most other countries who have frozen assets, which is to say that we are happy that we have done this. And we have legislation in place to say that's not going to be unfrozen until Russia's paid for what they've done to Ukraine. But this is a bit like the F-16s debate. You find yourself in a much more complex environment than people may understand, and which frankly I struggle to understand, even though I come back to this over and over, how legally you are able to liberate these assets to be able to pass them over to Ukraine for reconstruction is really difficult to get right. So we have a working group on use of frozen assets. We are talking with many other countries about the sort of legislation you need to evolve, such not just that you could do what you want to do, but that also it wouldn't result in multiple challenges in court. The current situation is that we don't have what is needed, and most countries don't have what is needed because this is a fairly unprecedented situation, and we've got to evolve them, and evolving them just takes time.
Could you adopt some practices of, say, the US, which already made a transfer of some assets of the oligarch who breached sanctions?
Well, let's see. As I say, this is part of what's being discussed in the working group.
How would you describe the backlash that the UK, which is among the most fierce supporters of Ukraine, is experiencing from Russia for this support?
I don't think it's changed much at all since before. I mean, since the Salisbury poisoning, the UK has, if you like, become much more sensitized to some of Russian malign activity. So actually the invasion of Ukraine really has only kind of confirmed that. I don't think it has made it any more of a revelation.
But speaking of Salisbury poisoning, how did that and then the Russia report that was released in 2020 impacted basically the way how the UK is tackling the security issue of itself against Russia.
But as I say, it was already starting off after Salisbury, so you had those mass expulsions. That, of course, naturally led by several countries to a review of those relationships. Our integrated review set out the national security threats that we perceived from Russia. It was a priority then, and then, if you like, it was kind of realised through the invasion of Ukraine. So I actually think we were more ready than than you may be suggesting, or that others may be suggesting, by the time the invasion came. And then, of course, you know that we were sharing intelligence that showed what we could see. The point is that we were evolving that capability for some years, having, slowly come to that realization that we needed a broader effort, if you like. So I actually think we were ready, and we remain ready, and our eyes are kind of open in a sort of 360 way here.
How is the perception of Ukraine in the eyes of British citizens has changed throughout these years, before the start of the full-scale invasion and after? And is there any war fatigue from what you've sensed? And if there is, how do you think it impacts the UK's willingness on the governmental level to carry on its support for Ukraine financially?
So to take your second point first, no, there's no war fatigue. I mean, you can see that in terms of the polling that we do of our own population. That support for government policy is very high. It's over 70% of the population believes the government is doing the right thing. That's really good numbers from the UK, and it has stayed more or less at about that level since the beginning of the invasion. So it's extraordinary. In the same way as we have strong clarity of policy in what we're doing here, we also have strong clarity of support. And it's very widespread across the UK. It's not like a London-centric thing. So I don't see that changing in the medium term. I was very struck. I was in the southwest of the country a couple of months ago, and I walked into this little church, middle of nowhere, top of a hill, tiny village. I just walked in there because it looked pretty, and I opened the door, and the first thing I saw was a little blue and yellow flag and a prayer for Ukraine. It's extraordinary. There's nothing else around. There's a clear sense from the British people that what Russia is doing is fundamentally just wrong, just not in tune with any of your most basic values and things you want as a basic human being. So I don't see that changing. And that then has its effect on future UK support. I don't see that changing either. So we have a committed Prime Minister right now. We have cross-government agreement and support for what this government is doing. It's a good situation to be in. The challenge for Ukraine from, I would say, September onwards is not to take that support for granted, not to just assume that it stays there. It comes about because of the public communications on what Ukraine is doing and how Ukraine is fighting, and then how the UK is helping. And it can't just be for the UK to do that. Ukrainian government and Ukrainian leaders and etc. Need to make sure they are continuing to message out Ukrainian will to fight. I would even say that Ukrainian will is stronger as a driver of support than how you are using UK capability. That's important, but people are moved more to do more when they are inspired by Ukrainian determination to defend their country.
What could be an example of this determination? What Ukraine has to do in order to show this willingness to fight?
What they've been doing. There isn't more. It's just to make sure that that doesn't drop. So I don't think there's any country that doesn't appreciate the, by the way, absolutely fantastic strategic communications work that is done by your foreign ministry, that is done by the Ministry of Defence. There is some very classy stuff, but the point is, it's also very personal, and it shows people around the world the human impact of the war, but also the achievements. And the achievements can be down to the very smallest level. One soldier meets one person in a village that has been liberated. These stories are incredibly powerful. They make the emotional connection in their heads. We provided this capability, and now this soldier has been to this house and liberated this house. People understand that in terms of their own aspirations.
Is there anything that Ukraine can do on the governmental level, on the state level, in order to ensure that the support continues? Is there anything that Ukraine can show to the West to make sure that the commitment stays?
But I don't think the West is the only audience here. So I come back again to, this is the diversified message. One of the recent things Ukrainian government's been doing really well is engaging with countries in the so-called global south, and with some success. You see that success in Security Council resolutions. You can see it in the 10-point peace plan. You can see it in the locating of the last meeting in Jeddah. There is some extraordinary bilateral relationship going on between Ukraine and countries that probably didn't know Ukraine wasn't part of Russia until this war began. Something, by the way, that pre-war perception is shared in the UK. To answer the first part of your earlier question, I think the Brits know so much more now about Ukrainians, about, frankly, how utterly cool the country is, even down to what kind of food you eat, because, of course, so many people have taken in Ukrainians and they're learning to make syrniki, and it's all fantastic. But they aren't the only people who are waking up to this understanding of Ukraine's history, this sense of what Russia really is, this colonial, fascist-leaning country, is something that I think is a dawning realization, not just for the West, but for other countries who tended to see that as a different part of history, geographically different part of history. This sense of Ukraine having been colonialized under Soviet occupation, that is a narrative that is understood by many other countries who have not been conventional partners of Ukraine, but are now very interested in the nature of this invasion.
How will the future of Russia look like after Ukraine's victory, in your opinion? If there is some political collapse within Russia, do you think that some countries might be actually scared of this consequence and thus be really careful about how Ukraine's victory could look like?
Oh God, I don't know what Russia will look like. Honestly, I don't care. I really don't. I think there is a short-term and medium-term prerogative, which is to assume that, let's say now, that Ukraine manages to push Russia out of its territory, that isn't going to stop Russia wanting to invade in the future, that I can foresee. So even if you got to a point of negotiation, I can't see a future right now in which Russia doesn't lose that visceral sense that Ukraine belongs to Russia. So, you know, in that sense, I can't tell you. It's not even in a sense relevant. You've got a security threat on your border, and we are all, as we said in the G7, going to have to work up these guarantees to help. As for accountability, well, we have put funding towards the International Criminal Court, both in terms of training investigators and putting some of our own investigators in there. Our program funding goes towards supporting women and children who have been raped by occupying forces and help them be able to produce their narratives so it can be part of those investigations. We are really closely involved in the range of accountability, but you know, the time that it takes or how Russia engages with it, that's for the future.
You were posted here in 2019. Throughout this time, many things have changed. What would you say stands out in your memories as the most challenging, probably, task that you had to do, and the most, you know, touching or incredible experience that you might have had?
I think maybe in the context of the war, the toughest may have been when, because of course Russia was doing before the war what it's doing now, it would use UN mechanisms to promote disinformation narratives about, for example, Crimea. And for Ukraine, these disinformation narratives were really clear. For many other countries at that time, when I first arrived in 2019, they weren't particularly clear. There was some sort of confusion about Crimea's status, for example. I think maybe my toughest work was to try to help get that narrative through, but we did get it through. But that's tough work, which oddly has become easier now with the invasion of Ukraine. As for what's the most touching, I think the most touching is that I'm out and about on the streets, you know, like anyone else is. You go and do your business. And most days I can't walk to the end of the street anywhere without being stopped by some random stranger I never met before who wants to say thank you to the UK. And I think that's really, really lovely. So every time that happens, I'm a little bit overwhelmed.
You tweeted a lot about, you know, having to shelter and having to live through this invasion. Is there anything that this experience taught you?
Yeah, goodness, I mean a lot, but probably the main thing was how much I had in me. to deal with it. So for everybody who had any kind of leadership job, and an ambassador is a leadership job, your leadership is tested in different ways. And this, I thought, was the ultimate test. So I remember being in Lviv in maybe 3 or 4 days after the invasion, one of the first missile strikes. And we all threw ourselves to the floor. In the early days, you didn't really know much what to do about missiles, but we threw ourselves to the floor. And I remember being on the bathroom floor in my tiny hotel room thinking, can I do this? Have I got it in me to do this? And I was acutely aware of my colleagues in rooms around me, and I was going to need to tell them, it's all right, we can work through this. And it took me about 3 seconds to work out that, yes, I had this in me. I may not have used it particularly, but now I was going to take out this resilience and use it. And I have never looked back from that moment, but I'm really proud to have found that it existed in me.